It's arguably the most famous piece of Israelite iconography, and while not a new discovery, the shattered pottery fragments known as Pithos A have recently exploded in popularity, appearing in videos from major creators and even on t-shirt designs of noteworthy scholars. But did these fragments really prove that the ancient Israelites believed that the Canaanite fertility goddess Asherah was the consort of Israel's god, Adonai? Or is the data being overhyped, or worse, manipulated? Hey everyone, if you're new here, my name's Brad, I'm a PhD candidate, and on this channel I dive into the fascinating world of mythology as it relates to the biblical text. And in this video, I'm going to unpack the details of this inscription, how it reshapes our understanding of ancient Israelite religion and Adonai, and highlight key data points and connections that I haven't seen other videos cover. Now let's start at the beginning. In the mid-1970s, archaeologists excavating at Kuntillet Ajrud uncovered a collection of painted storage jars and inscriptions unlike anything found before. These storage jars were written in both Hebrew and Phoenician script, and on one of these storage jars were inscribed the Hebrew words, "I have blessed you to Adonai of Samaria and to his Asherah." Now, almost immediately after the announcement of this finding, headlines began to explode, claiming that evidence had been found to support the notion that Adonai had a consort, and that consort was none other than Asherah. And although a final excavation report wouldn't be published for another 40 years, Pandora's box had been opened. And this idea of Adonai and his Asherah would echo throughout scholarship, media, and popular culture, etched not just in pottery, but also in the modern imagination. However, scholars both critical and confessional are quick to note the complexities of this discovery, in contrast to much of the popular content that is circulating the web. For starters, the grammar of the text is odd, as scholars such as Dr. Andrew Henry at Religion for Breakfast have noted. It reads, Adonai and his Asherah, and the Hebrew language does not permit a suffix on a proper noun, although some have contested this notion within this instance. An example of this would be that you could write his house, but not his David. And to think of this in English terms, which I understand is not a one-to-one, but just to provide something that is concrete. If Billy and Jenny, let's say, were a couple, you could say Billy and his wife, but you wouldn't say Billy and his Jenny. And this is very similar to what those scholars are saying. And in addition to this, the term Asherah is used in two distinct senses within the biblical text. It can denote a cultic object, which is often rendered an Asherah pole, or it can serve as the proper name of the Canaanite goddess. But it's important to note that the vast majority of occurrences do refer to the cultic object rather than the deity Asherah. Now, in terms of the actual image and inscription itself, several scholars were quick to see this as a description or a caption for the images where the inscription must identify the figures as Adonai and Asherah. And this is the position that Ryan Lewis, who wrote a great article on this subject, which Dan McClellan mentioned in one of his videos responding to Mike Jones. And I've engaged with this article as well for a paper I was writing on iconography, not to be published. This was simply just for my studies. But Ryan's article is very well written, and it is also a very dense piece of scholarly work. And one of the pieces of evidence he provides is that the husband and wife pose within this image provide support to the identification of Adonai and his Asherah. The male is forward-facing and in a dominant position. The two figures overlap, and the arms and legs of the male fully cross those of the female. And he goes through a list of other evidences as well. But even with all of the evidence, things may not be so straightforward, because the late Assyriologist Pirhiya Beck, and I hope I'm pronouncing her name right, I apologize if I butchered it, but she believed that the drawings in the text may not even be from the same time period. And this is actually a view which biblical and religious scholar Dan McClellan seems to hold as well. But going back to Beck, and to provide a little bit more detail as to her conclusions, she authored an article on the imagery at this particular site, and she determined that within this image, that not only were the images and the text from a different time period, but some of the imagery was added on at a later point in time as well. And what Beck determined was that figure T and the lyre player U were drawn before figure S, and that the inscription was added later as the third and last stage in the composition of this particular piece of imagery. And also by a different hand than the one that drew figure S, which was stage 2, as well as figures T and U, which was stage 1. And if Beck is correct in this, the inscription may not be an integral part of the scene, but rather no more than just some graffiti that someone wrote after the fact. And that may have nothing to do whatsoever with the original intent of the imagery. However, this isn't to say that whomever wrote the inscription on this particular imagery did not view these two figures in this way. But what it would show is that they would see this at either a later point in time, or perhaps they were inscribing what the common belief of the day was. But even if this is correct, it begs the question on which image is which deity. Because if Beck is correct, it was only the lyre player and figure T that appeared at the same point in time. And there's actually two scholars that date back to 1998, and they determined that the best candidate for Asherah in this particular image is not the lyre player or either of the two bovine figures, but rather the stylized tree that is apparently riding on the back of a lion mount. Now, going back to this image for a second, most iconographers now think that the bovine figures are representations of the Egyptian god Bes. And Bes is depicted as a dwarf with large ears, long hair, as well as a beard, also bow-legged, and in addition to that, with prominent genitals. And this is because he is the Egyptian god of childbirth, fertility, sexuality, also humor and war, but he served primarily as a protector god of pregnant women and children. And the Egyptians believed that he stood guard during childbirth, ready to strike any forces that sought to harm either the mother or the child. But Bes aside, what I want to do is two things. One is focus on the bovine features of these two figures. And second, I want to assume for argument's sake that this inscription does describe Adonai as having Asherah as his consort, and compare these to the data that we find within the biblical text. Because even if this inscription is proof of this claim of Adonai having a wife or consort Asherah, it changes nothing within the view of Orthodox Yahwism. And I'm not claiming that there was a finalized biblical text at this point in Israelites' history. I know that there was not, but there was still an Orthodox view of Adonai. And that is precisely what the prophets who showed up starting in about the 8th century BCE, right around the time of this inscription. And before you jump to the comment section, I am going to address the Deuteronomistic redactions found within the prophets, specifically within the book of Hosea. But first, we'll start with the united monarchy of Saul, David, and Solomon. And yes, technically Saul did have a son, Ishbosheth, that reigned for about 2 years between him and David. But regardless, this united monarchy lasted until about 931 BCE. And all dates that I'm giving here are approximate. And after Solomon's death, the monarchy was divided into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And Jeroboam I was the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel, roughly 931 to 901 BCE timeframe. And he established two strategic shrines, one at Bethel in the south near the northern and southern kingdom border, and one in the far north in Dan. And the reason Jeroboam set up these shrines was because he faced a serious problem. And that was that the temple, where the Israelites were commanded to make 3 pilgrimages per year, was located in Jerusalem, which was located and controlled by the southern kingdom. So this was a political move to set up these shrines. And as I mentioned, very strategic, one in the far north and then one in the far south. And so in making these shrines, it's speculated that this was in an effort to win the allegiance of those who were loyal to Adonai within the northern kingdom. Now, what is interesting to note about Jeroboam is that according to 1 Kings 11:40, he was exiled to Egypt until Solomon's death. And this is important because these two shrines at both Dan and Bethel set up by Jeroboam I featured bull calf or golden calf type imagery. And these golden calf shrines were likely linked to the Apis bull cult of Memphis in Egypt. Apis was known as the incarnation of the son of Osiris. And this sacred bull was a fertility deity who gave agricultural and reproductive fertility to the kingdom, as well as life, health, and strength to the king. Now, it's also possible that Jeroboam combined elements of Canaanite bull god worship at these shrines as well. And this is due to the presence of both Canaanite and Egyptian motifs within the Israelite calf cult. Now, it is speculated that these bull calves that Jeroboam set up were originally intended to be symbolic of Adonai. This is strikingly similar to one of the most well-known stories within the entire biblical corpus, that of Exodus 32 and the wandering Israelites setting up the golden calf in the wilderness. And this breach of covenant quickly spiraled. These golden bull gods soon became identified with religious idolatry. They were recognized as other gods in 1 Kings 14, and by the time of Hosea, the bull gods were renounced by the prophets as idols. You can see Hosea chapter 8, verses 4 and 5 for that. Now, this is viewed as part of the Deuteronomistic redaction, which I have yet to cover. And also by this time, the golden bull had become associated with the Canaanite fertility cult deities. And the worship of the calf god was thoroughly interwoven with Baalism. And if you're curious for more on the progression of Israelite false worship, you can read about that in 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 15 through 17. Hey, if you haven't already and you're enjoying this video, be sure to like and subscribe. All right, back to the video. Now, all of these connections to Canaanite and Egyptian motifs are critical to the discussion surrounding Asherah as the consort of Adonai, because both Baal and El, who was the head of the Canaanite pantheon, were described in bull-type language. And according to scholars such as Mark Smith and others, there was an Adonai-El fusion that occurred in the 8th century BCE. And additionally, as Mark Smith and Michael Coogan noted in their book, Stories from Ancient Canaan, there was a fusion of Baal and El language in descriptions of Adonai and his activity. And the popularity of the worship of Baal in Israel is illustrated both by the repeated attacks on it by the biblical writers and by the use of Baal as an element in personal names, such as the names that both Saul and David gave their children that contained the Baal element. And there's also the Baal and El epithets that are used to describe Adonai throughout the Old Testament. And one example of this is the rider on the cloud language used to describe Baal in the Canaanite literature, and that becomes a way that Adonai is identified within the Old Testament as well. Then if you think about this in New Testament terms, in the book of Acts, when Jesus has his ascension, Jesus rides on the cloud to go up. And this perhaps demonstrates that the theological polemics against Canaanite religion were not subject to the Hebrew Bible alone, but also carried on within the New Testament. Now, because of this fusion that occurred within the 8th century BCE, along with Israel's repeated idolatry and turning from Adonai, there were likely plenty of ancient Israelites that adopted the concept of Asherah no longer as the consort of El, but the consort of Adonai, or else prophets such as Hosea wouldn't have bothered speaking about this. Now, it has been stated by credible scholars that no one within the ancient world, and particularly the ancient Israelites, condemned the worship of Asherah until the Deuteronomistic literature in the 7th century BCE. And therefore, the references in Hosea are solely attributed to the Deuteronomistic redaction of the 7th century BCE, which would be some 200 years after the initial composition of Hosea. However, there are a few things to note regarding these redactions. And if we look at what these redactions are, and this is taken from a book called the Book of the 12, it's dealing with the Deuteronomistic additions to the first 4 of the 12 minor prophets. And as you can see, Hosea is right here. So all of these verse references here are considered to be the Deuteronomistic redactions within Hosea. And to quote these authors directly, they state that the Deuteronomistic additions to the book of Hosea are mainly concerned with the worship of other gods and idolatry. And they give a couple examples as well. But what is interesting to note here is there are many instances within the book of Hosea where foreign god worship is alluded to that is not within this list of Deuteronomistic redactions that the authors provide. And the first, and perhaps the most notable within the text, is from Hosea chapter 1, verse 2, and really the remainder of chapter 1. This is where Hosea is commanded to take a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom with her. And it is because the land has committed great whoredom by forsaking Adonai. And we see a similar story unfold in chapter 3, verse 1. Now, chapter 3, verse 1 is part of the Deuteronomistic redaction. However, chapter 1, starting in verse 2, and the remainder of that chapter is not. And in the scholarly commentary on Hosea titled Hosea, a Textual Commentary, the author notes that this is a symbolic vision in which a woman's disloyalty to her partner is a metaphor for Israel's and Judah's disloyalty to God, which is expressed by worshiping other gods. And what this indicates is that from the very beginning of Hosea, idolatry, or the worship of foreign gods, is a major theme throughout the book of Hosea. There's also passages such as Hosea 7, verse 8, that describes Ephraim, which is a reference to the northern kingdom of Israel, mixing with the surrounding peoples. And with the evil deeds of Samaria in chapter 7, verse 1, and Samaria was the capital city of the northern kingdom at the time of Hosea. And then in chapter 10, Samaria is linked directly to calf worship. It says in verse 5, the inhabitants of Samaria tremble for the calf of Beit Aven. Its people mourn for it, and so do its idolatrous priests, those who rejoice over it and over its glory, for it is departed from them. And then in chapter 13, verse 16, it talks about how Samaria shall bear her guilt because she has rebelled against her God. And this is incredibly interesting when you consider the inscription from Kuntillet Ajrud, where it had the bovine figures with the inscription above that read, I have blessed you to Adonai of Samaria and to his Asherah. And none of these verses that I've provided have come from that Deuteronomistic redaction. And even if someone wanted to come in and say, well, perhaps that's part of it, okay, I'm fair and I'm open to that. But if we go back to Beck's conclusion from earlier, the inscription came at a latter point in time than the 3 figures, and those figures were not drawn at the same time either. Another important figure that is referenced 6 times in Hosea is Baal. And none of these 6 instances occur within the Deuteronomistic redactions. And what this indicates is that the worship of Baal within the northern kingdom of Israel was a real problem at the time of Hosea. And while there's no references to El, Canaanite religion is complex. This is demonstrated well by Mark Smith and Michael Coogan, returning to their book Stories from Ancient Canaan, where they state, one of the issues connected with El is how to assess his importance in Ugaritic religion. By the time the Baal cycle was composed, Baal was king of the pantheon. Nevertheless, in the surviving Canaanite stories, El is by no means an impotent ruler. While El was head of the pantheon, and actively so in earlier stories, Baal was becoming the dominant Canaanite deity, and the Baal cycle perhaps reflects this process. There seems to be a sort of co-regency between El as the executive power and Baal as the military power in the cosmos. And ultimately, this is important in addressing the question on whether or not Asherah was viewed as the consort of Adonai. And as Caitlin Hubler points out in this article, one key difference between the deities is the presence of a female consort. Perhaps Hosea is all too aware of the many location-specific Baalim, and consequently, their many female consorts. Scholarship on Hosea has long recognized that Hosea associates worship of Baal with marital infidelity, but it may also be the case that the metaphor works both ways. Just as Israel is chastised for taking on new lovers in addition to Adonai, so Adonai ought to not be confused as a god who takes multiple wives. In this case, Adonai's lack of a consort is directly related to his identity as Israel's husband. Israel must recognize that she was the true wife of Adonai. He had none other. So ultimately, we return to the original question. Does this inscription from Kuntillet Ajrud prove that the ancient Israelites believed that Adonai had a consort named Asherah? And the answer is both yes and no. Because these pottery fragments at best demonstrate that some Israelites had merged the concept of El's consort Asherah as being the consort of Adonai, which is directly correlated to the blending of worship of Adonai with the worship of the surrounding nations, perhaps beginning with Jeroboam I, the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel. But this is something that was heavily condemned by the biblical prophets, and this does not reflect the view of Orthodox Yahwism. And in that view, Asherah was never a consort of Adonai. And in fact, Adonai never had a consort. But the importance of this discovery cannot be understated, because these famous pottery fragments may provide a glimpse into the instability of Israelite religion during a time of dynastic division, shortly after the United Monarchies' collapse and influence from their ancient Near Eastern neighbors and their religion had taken full effect on daily and religious life. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out my other videos and playlists on mythology. And you can start by clicking these links right here. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one.